if you want to listen or if you have any other questions. And okay, so from there on, Wikus, and you can just tell everyone to mute their microphones and so on.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So apart from welcoming all the people who are logging in from far away, welcome to all those old people like me who now have been forced to bring the technology under control to do this remotely. It actually works wonderfully well if once you get used to it. So I think the world doesn't quite go back to where it was when we finished with this. We may do much more of this remote stuff even after the coronavirus has passed. What we were doing before the coronavirus hit us is we were going through a presentation where we looked at what are the prospects for the 2020s and the influence especially of the rise of populism through the 2010s and how that may affect the 2020s. And one of the themes there was to say, well, what happens when you have a real crisis and you've got populists like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump and various other populists? Bolsonaro in Brazil strikes me as a good example of a real populist. What happens if you have a real crisis and you have these people in charge? That actually creates a significant problem for you potentially, because you just don't get the reaction to the crisis that you should have. And I think that's proven out. I think that the world would have been significantly better off with some more serious leadership if we like. But what's happened is that the world and everything that we expect of the world has been overtaken by the coronavirus. So a lot of concern obviously around the world about this, and what we thought is we'll share our views of how this pans out with all of our clients, just so they understand kind of where we come from and what we are doing for our clients and with our clients in order to deal with this. So the first issue that we encounter when we're looking at the coronavirus is that initially this was presented to the world as somewhat of a bad flu. So you might get 2 or 3 times the mortality that you would have from a normal flu season. But that's actually not quite true. The problem with the coronavirus is that the mortality of the coronavirus is much more serious, and therefore it is too serious for people to ignore. And we're not 100% clear on where mortality lies yet, because we're not testing well enough around the world to understand exactly what percentage of people who contract it actually die. But it looks at this point as if you leave the virus to go through your population, you end up somewhere between 0.5% and 2% mortality of those people who contract it. And it's likely that between 60 and 80% of your population will contract it, because it's actually a very, very a virus that spreads extremely easily. So why does a virus spread easily? 2 reasons. The one is it's actually easy to transmit because it transmits through droplets in the air. So it's very easy to transmit. But the other thing is it's got a very long incubation period. So people are infected with the virus and are starting to spread the virus long before they understand that they're ill. So that obviously makes it a lot easier for the virus to spread. So it's a virus that spreads very easily on the one hand, and it's also a virus that has quite a high fatality rate. Now, just to give you an idea of the numbers we're talking about, South Africa, we've got 50 million people. If 80% of people were to contract it, 40 million people will have some form of the illness. If you then have a 2% mortality, you will see about 800,000 people die. Am I right? Yeah, 800,000. So 800,000 in a population of 50 million is a lot of people. So in the US, that same number would translate into something like 3 million people dying. So very large numbers of people would be affected and very large numbers of people would die. I'm just going to put up the presentation quickly that we had to just give you an idea of the mortality stats that we have at the moment. Now, these are evolving. They're not necessarily very accurate yet, just because of the fact that in many places where you come under pressure, you're only testing people who are already ill. So let me just ask, first of all, can everybody see the screen with the little bubbles on it? If you're not seeing the screen with the little bubbles. Okay.
Yes,
so
we see it. Thanks. I can see it.
Okay. So if we're seeing that screen, we've got numbers for South Korea, China, and Italy on the screen. And what you will see is that right at the back end, there's an average mortality rate, which for Italy at the time that they did these figures was standing between 6.8 and 7%. So between 6.8 and 7% of people that they've tested have died. So that's an extremely high number. In South Korea, where they've got less of an epidemic and where they've tested much more widely and many more people, that number is between 0.8 and 0.9%, which is still very high. So what you have to say is that normal seasonal flu, that number is probably 0.1%. So this is at least 10 times more lethal than normal flu, but it may be 100 times more lethal than normal flu if you look at the Italian figures. So one of the scary stats there for Italy is that if you are older than 80 and you contract the virus, their experience is a fifth of people die of the virus. And in China, not so much less. So still around 15% of people over 80 who contracted die. What actually worries me significantly personally is you will see, if you look at the Italy numbers, the number for people 50 to 59 is 1%. And the number for people between 60 and 69 is 3.5%. So in August this year, my chances of actually dying if I contract the virus increases by 3.5 times. So that's a really worrying stat for me. So I hope this is all passed by the time we reach August, just so that I can deal with this while I'm in my 50s and not in my 60s. But what you will see is that the numbers of people dying when it spreads through old people is really, really worrying. And what that means is that there are so many people dying that no country where it has taken hold has failed to lock down. So the question is, what do you do when you start getting these infections? And what actually happens is some countries lock down early and some countries lock down late, but all of them lock down. And at this point, it looks like it's much better to lock down early than to lock down late, because if you lock down late, you actually have enough of an epidemic locally to really put massive pressure on your health system and probably to overwhelm it. So what we're seeing in New York at the moment is they locked it down late. They are now in full on lockdown, but they locked down late. And because of that, they actually have an epidemic that is putting massive pressure on their hospital systems. So what happens from a medical perspective is we don't have a cure for this. We actually don't even have a treatment for this. So the only thing that the medical profession can do for you is to kind of make you comfortable. And then if you actually get to the point where you are struggling to breathe, they will put you on a respirator. And the respirator, not a respirator, a ventilator. A ventilator will breathe on your behalf or make your lungs breathe. And that will probably save about 20 to 30% of the people who need to go onto a respirator get saved by the respirator. The rest actually still dies. So it still seems, if we look at it, that there's a much higher mortality rate in places where the system gets overwhelmed, where the medical system gets overwhelmed. So that pushes up your mortality rate. Now, all of that is interesting from a medical point of view, but it's not really interesting from an economic point of view, except from the point of view that everybody locks down. So what is the economic consequences of locking your economy down? Because if I can use a medical analogy in this case, what happens is that we are in the situation where you're putting the patient into an induced coma. So what we're saying is, please, everybody, we don't want you to work as hard as possible as we normally do. We don't want you to be doing all kinds of innovative things. We want you to go home and sit on your couch and not go anywhere for as long as possible. That's pretty much what governments are telling people worldwide. So this is not only in South Africa. In South Africa, we've chosen to lock down fairly early. So we don't have a lot of cases yet. We don't have massive pressure on our intensive care units. Our hospitals are not swamped. What is swamped in South Africa is testing capacity. If you phone into Lancet and you say, I'm having some symptoms, I think I might have coronavirus, they'll say, well, unless you answer positively to all 5 of the questions, meaning have you traveled, do you have symptoms, are you vulnerable, all of those things, unless you answer positively to all 5, we're not going to test you. And by the way, if we do test you, we are a little bit behind, so it'll be 2 to 3 weeks before you get the result. 2 to 3 weeks, you'll either have lived or died. So basically, testing is not up to scratch, but everything else is still very much under control in South Africa. But in essence, everybody locks down, and the question is, what are the consequences of locking down? And what we're seeing now is that the consequences of locking down is very severe from an economic point of view. So I'm going to show you a graph quickly that just demonstrates this severity, because this is now the US, which has really started fairly seriously to lock down in the last 3 weeks. So we've now got 2 weeks worth of statistics from the US. So one of the things in the economy that is measured most often is new claims for unemployment insurance in the US. So that's actually a very good way to say how well or badly are things going right now in the US economy. And so what happens is that you measure all the people who are claiming unemployment insurance for the first time in a specific week. And this is normally quite an accurate stat. At the moment, we think that the stat may not be quite as accurate. That's the one that I need, but it's not actually showing. So that stat, the reason why we don't believe it's necessarily fully accurate is that the capacity that the states have in the US to deal with this.
Just hold on, I'm just trying to get that slide on. I do not know why that one is displaying. I'm going to stop presenting and then just try
again. So we'll just go back to the right slide. I'll get back to the flattening the curve slides in a moment. But the highest number roughly over time, over the last 5 decades, for these new claims in the US was in the order of 500,000 in a specific week. And this normally comes towards the end of a recession. So it's actually a lagging indicator in terms of how we would normally deal with this. There you see the stat. So what you will see here is that the first week after they started serious lockdown in the US, that stat that normally peaks out at somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million, actually 3.3 million new claims for unemployment insurance in 1 week. So completely unprecedented and off the charts. The thing that happens though, we need the next slide, please. The thing that happens is that the next week, this was actually even worse. So here you see the slide for the next week. It doesn't, on the face of it, look so much different, but you just have to look at the scale. The scale's now on the left-hand side. The next week, claims were 6.6 million. So in the second week of lockdown, 6.6 million people claimed for initial unemployment claims. So what we've done is we've lost 10 million formal jobs in the US in 2 weeks' time. So we're waiting with bated breath for week 3. I think we get that stat tomorrow. So massive increase in unemployment in the US. Obviously, in the US, businesses react very quickly. If they see that they're not going to have income, they will very quickly cut costs. So this may not be quite as quick in the rest of the world, but it just gives you an idea of the unprecedented nature of the slowdown in the economy that we're seeing. Remember now, the US has about 160 million people employed. So this has probably taken the unemployment rate from 3.5% to 13% odd already. And it's highly likely that the unemployment rate will top 20% very soon. Now that again is an unprecedented number in outside of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So in the credit crunch of 2008, the most severe recession after the Second World War, unemployment went to about 12%. So suddenly and overnight, you're seeing massive unemployment. So the conclusion from an economic point of view is this is now the patient going into an induced coma. The problem with the patient in an induced coma is that the patient can't eat and function normally. So you actually have to administer some food through intravenous feeding for your patient. And what you need to do when you lock down is you need to give some disaster relief, because the lockdown itself is a disaster to the economy. So you have to come in and start doing disaster relief. The Americans, by the way, still the leading economy in the world. They have already approved a $2 trillion disaster relief package. A lot of people talk about a stimulus package, but that's actually not a very good description of what's going on, because it's a little bit like describing what you're giving your patient that's in an induced coma as giving the patient steroids. It's no use giving a patient that's in a coma steroids. The patient won't exercise and build muscle while he's lying in bed. You may administer steroids once he gets up, but at this point, it's just disaster relief. You're just putting in intravenous feeding onto the system. So one of the things that the Americans are doing is they are saying, well, people will need money while they're in lockdown, and a lot of people won't have money, so let's just give everybody some money. So they are posting checks to every single American. Every adult gets $1,200, and every child gets $500. And the checks are literally being posted as we speak. Now, if we were to do the same in South Africa, it would make very little difference to our economy, because no one will actually receive the checks. And when they do receive it, they won't know what to do with it, because no one actually deals with checks anymore. What happens in the US is that at least puts some money into the hands of vulnerable people so they can cope with the effects of the lockdown. The other thing that happens is they are being very generous in terms of the unemployment insurance. They pay. Some of the senators were actually protesting that some people may now be getting more unemployment relief than they were earning when they were in employment, and that might disincentivize them from actually working. But actually they're being told not to work, so disincentivizing them is not really a very important issue in their lives. But the stats we're having out of China for the first quarter and the early stats out of Italy and so on, is actually across the board. It says that the economy really grinds to a halt, and it looks like we are losing roughly 30% of all production when the economy goes into proper lockdown. So a minus 30% GDP growth for the period that you are in the serious lockdown. Now, you can actually extrapolate to how much is that in a year if you lock down for 2 months and all of those things. But what it means is at that point, you're losing 30% of production. And the implication of this is that it has a very serious impact on virtually all of the participants in the economy. So some companies will continue to operate. So if you're a food retailer, you'll actually be doing very well because people still need to buy food. If you're a food producer, you'll be doing very well. People will stock up on food and buy a little bit more than normal. But if you are a restaurant, you have no business because you are forced to close. If you are a barber shop, you've got no business because you're forced to close. If you are in a massive number of small services businesses have basically been forced to close. And the owners of those small services businesses are not counted in the unemployed because they actually business owners, but they have to close their business and hope that they might someday be able to reopen. Now, the unfortunate thing is the stat for reopening is not so good in the sense that we know that in the first quarter alone, 460,000 businesses in China went bankrupt. So the moment, if for most businesses need the bulk of their turnover in order to just stay open. So if we're losing 30% of turnover, we're probably going to lose at least a third of the businesses that's open in the economy before the lockdown ends, unless those businesses gets bailed out by government. So all over the world, governments have schemes to bail out small businesses, but the complaint across the board is these things are bureaucratic. We don't know how to access it. The money is slow to flow, and so on. But in South Africa, we actually have very limited resources to apply to those things. So that's the first point, is everybody locks down. And when you go into a serious lockdown, you actually lose 30% of your production. And that is devastating to the balance sheets of individuals, of businesses, and of governments. Because as you can imagine now, government revenue is also collapsing. Which is actually the least of the worries for government, is the fact that their revenues are collapsing. But at the same time, the demands on government is more because they now have to attend to serious health issues. And especially in the United States, health is a state issue, and state governments in the US are not allowed to run deficits. So if their revenue collapses, they are actually forced to cut back on expenses. So if you're the governor of a state in the US, you are in real trouble because you now actually have to decide where to cut back. And the disaster relief package actually gave very limited aid to states. So the US Congress will be very quickly forced to pass another piece of legislation for more disaster relief to go into to actually support the states. Otherwise, it will be disastrous. The problem that you now encounter from an investment point of view is that this is completely unprecedented from an investment point of view. Because what normally happens with investments is that the problem spreads from the financial markets into the real economy. So for virtually all recessions we know of, the problem originates in the credit market or in the financial markets and then spreads into the rest of the economy. The oil crisis may be something of an exception to that rule, where it actually originated in the real economy as well. But in this case, the real economy is melting down, and financial markets just don't know how to deal with this. And we think that it's actually much more severe than the financial markets are pricing it at this moment. Because actually, even of listed companies, probably 30% will go bankrupt unless they get bailed out. by the government. So if you just remove 30% of companies, that should already bring your indexes right down. Now, that obviously depends on what kind of industry you're in. So, and that depends on how long lasting the lockdown is. So the second thing about locking down is that once you've locked down, you have not solved the problem. So there was an initial thought that all you need to do is to flatten the curve. Can we maybe get the curves onto the graphs, please? So the whole idea is that the way that you actually get out on the other side of this is that you want general immunity to this virus in your community. And the original idea was all you need to do is to just slow it down so that everybody doesn't get it at the same time, and that you then actually get into a position where there we go. There we are. So this is the red graph that you should be seeing says that without intervention, you exceed your capacity by about 1 or 1.5 times. And if you could just slow the virus down by locking down somewhat, it will be slower and your healthcare system will have the capacity to deal with this. The problem is this is actually not an accurate representation of the real world, because the amount of cases versus the actual capacity is on a completely different scale. So if we look at the next graph, you'll see what actually happens. So that red line right at the bottom, that's the capacity to deal with these cases in the healthcare systems. And then you have various slower and faster graphs. But you can see that no matter how slow or fast your graph is, you vastly exceed your capacity to deal with this from a medical perspective very, very quickly. So that's why the lockdowns have to be very severe, because you actually have to bring it in under the red line. Whereas by nature, if you just left it, it would go to the black line, and it would exceed your capacity by multiples. So that's the reality of it. So effectively, the strategy of not actually locking down, or if you're not in a position to lock down, means that there will be a huge number of people who get ill, and many of those people will die, and your medical system will be completely overwhelmed by it. That's the reality of it. So what happens in most countries, you can take the graphs off, please, thank you. What happens in most countries is they lock down initially, and so some people lock down early, some people take a bit longer to take it seriously. It looks like in America, Donald Trump eventually took it seriously when one of his good friends in New York, he wanted to talk to him on the phone, and he was told, you can't talk to this person, he is in ICU on a ventilator. So not talking to anybody. So as soon as it got close to him personally, he actually started taking it seriously. So everybody takes it seriously eventually. But then so the second thing that we know is that lockdowns do work. If you lock down for 3 to 4 weeks very seriously, your cases start dropping. So we're seeing a drop in cases in places like New York and places like Italy and so on. The cases are actually starting to diminish because of very serious lockdown. So once you lock down, you actually do bring the whole thing under control. In China, they've had no new local cases now for 3 days in a row. So China, where the whole thing started, are not seeing any new cases. The problem that you then have is you still have to keep locked down, otherwise it will return. Now, it may be, and it's likely to be, that your lockdown doesn't have to be quite as serious. Once you've brought it under control, one of the major things you have to do is to keep all foreigners out, or all people coming from different places. So in South Africa, part of the lockdown is you're not allowed to cross provincial borders. This is in order to make sure that if we get an epidemic in a specific part of the country, we can contain it in that part of the country, so that you don't actually get movement of people in and out that spreads the virus. That's the theory behind it. But also what you do is you still don't allow large gatherings. So people are not allowed to go to churches, mosques, etc. People on big sporting events don't take place, and so on. Restaurants probably don't open. So there's still a very large part of the economy that stays locked down until such time as we get some kind of resolution to the crisis. So our best estimate at this stage is in that second stage of lockdown, you lose about 10% of production. Now, losing 10% of production throughout your economy is enough to make sure that there's no net profit in the whole economy, meaning companies making losses will make larger losses than companies that are making profits will make profits. So disastrous from an investment point of view for companies, just because companies on the whole will not be making profits. And the longer this lasts, obviously, the bigger the impact will be. So the estimate at this point is that balance sheets by the end of a long shutdown period will have been devastated. Very few companies or people or governments will come out of this with intact balance sheets, meaning that you will use your cash or you will use your credit facilities, and your position, your financial position, will be substantially weakened throughout this. So the next question then becomes, how do we resolve this? When do we get out of it? And the answer is you get out of it when there is a measure of resistance to the virus throughout the population, or if you have a good way of treating people who contract the virus. So there's one of three ways in which it resolves. So one way in which it resolves is it rips through the population. You get 60 or 70% of people infected. A lot of people die, and then you get out of it on the other side with so-called general immunity or herd immunity, meaning that there are so many people in the population who've already had it and are resistant that the virus stops spreading, but it makes a small-scale comeback from time to time. So every winter, you're likely to have a couple of people die from the coronavirus, but actually the bulk of the population has already had it and is immune. So that's the one way it happens. So if you didn't intervene in lockdown, that's what would have happened. That process of going through it probably takes you something between 4 and 6 months. So it spreads through your population, people get ill, people die, and 4 to 6 months later, you're out of it at the other end. So that's the fastest resolving of it. And some governments have toyed with the idea of allowing this to happen in their economies. So initially, Boris Johnson announced that Britain would actually not lock down, but go for so-called herd immunity. As soon as people really started getting ill, he changed his mind, and he very quickly locked the economy down, not quickly enough to save himself, it looks like. So he's quite ill of the virus, and many of his cabinet are ill with the virus, so it's not a discriminatory virus. You can't actually plead importance and have it skip you. But the point is that very few governments will eventually choose from the beginning to just wait for herd immunity. Most governments will actually try to lock down. And so that's the one way it resolves. The other way it resolves is if we get a vaccine. If we get an effective vaccine against this, that will also resolve the crisis, because you will vaccinate most people in the world and the problem will go away. The head of Johnson & Johnson was on TV a couple of days ago. They will be starting human trials on some vaccines very soon. And if those human trials are effective, they will be able to start rolling this out to the general population early in next year. And by the middle of next year, they'll be able to manufacture billions of these vaccine doses, and you will be able to vaccinate across the world. So the crisis resolves gradually in the first half of next year if we're waiting for a vaccine at the earliest. So that's the most optimistic wave vaccine problem. So that means effectively a large portion of lockdown for most of the world for another year. The third way it resolves is if you find a medicine that is effective against the virus. And those medicines fall into two categories. The one category is a completely new medicine that has to go through the same testing process, the same manufacturing process as a vaccine. So that's also probably something for next year. But it may be that an existing medicine works. So all kinds of existing medicines are now in trial, chloroquine, one of them, to see whether it might actually work against this. One of the things that they are saying might be effective in terms of ameliorating it is the TB vaccine. So the TB vaccine actually gives you general immunity. So this may actually make you more resistant to the coronavirus. If that's the case, most people in South Africa have actually been vaccinated against TB. So maybe the South African population is less affected by this because of the fact that we've got the general TB problem. Part of our testing problem is also likely to be solved by the fact that they are repurposing our TB testing ability to start testing for coronavirus. So testing may be much better soon in South Africa because we're converting our TB testing into coronavirus testing as we speak. So we'll get a better idea of what the real situation in South Africa is. So, but if some kind of existing medicine works, the thing that's good about that is that you can start actually dealing with it very quickly because of the fact that you already know what the side effects are. You already know which populations it's it's resistant to, etc. But what's interesting to us from all of this is really the investment implications. So let me get back to first of all, just quickly to what I think will happen in South Africa. I think South Africa falls into the category of countries that cannot enforce a lockdown for a long period of time, effectively. And therefore, what will happen in South Africa is South Africa will eventually find that it spreads through the general population very quickly. A lot of people get ill and a lot of people die. And we get out of it fairly quickly on the other side. So by September this year, we're probably on the other side of this epidemic in South Africa, with a lot of people dead behind it, unfortunately. To some extent, the economic effects are muted because most of the people who die will be old people, will not have the need for grants. So the economic effects may not be that dire in the long run, but in the short run, still locking down for or having a severe illness in your population for 6 months will still have a devastating effect on the economy. But from an investment point of view then, what should we say about this? And the first thing I would say is, I think that this crisis is significantly more severe than the credit crunch of 2008, 2009. And therefore, it asks for a drawdown in equity markets that is at least as large as the drawdown was in 2008. And in 2008, markets went from top to bottom down 60%. So as we speak, markets around the world are down about 20%. So they went down about 30 and they've come back about 10. So let's just say we're in the 20 to 30% down range for stock markets. And we believe that is way too little. And the reason for this is it's exactly because the markets are struggling to deal with this thing of saying it originates in the real economy, and we are struggling to deal with it from a financial market point of view. We don't know how to treat it exactly. So we think that markets have not adjusted anywhere close to how much they should eventually adjust. And so our best view of it is that it will be a classical bull market with, I think in bull markets they talk about suckers rallies. There'll be rallies in between, but every time that you look at it, the markets will go, the new low point will be lower than the previous low point, and we'll reach the low point in markets probably 6 to 9 months from now. when the real devastation in the economy becomes clear. Because the problem with this is not only the virus that leads to the shutdowns, but at the end of the shutdowns, you will have all participants in the economy having very little confidence, wanting to not spend, but to fix their balance sheets. So they will all want to produce as much as possible, but they will all want to reduce their debt. And therefore, that's a classical definition of a severe recession. So when we end the coronavirus issue, we're still in a severe recession around the world. So we think 60% down is what we need in the markets to deal with this. That basically means that markets from their current levels still have to halve in order to get to the right place. So our advice to our clients who are prospective clients, all our existing clients are basically in cash, and we're waiting for the right time to re-enter the market. But what we are seeing is if we're starting to deal with a potential client that has large equity exposure, we are saying to our clients, well, the first thing you need to do is to do proper financial planning. So have a look at all the money that you might want to withdraw from your investments in the next 6 years. Make sure that's in cash. And even if you have to realize losses, cash it in now. And then with all the long-term money, we're saying, if you're following our proper advice, you'll actually cash in everything, but you should be cashing at least half in order to participate in the opportunities that will present itself when the markets reach the bottom. So we believe that there will be a fantastic investment opportunity at the bottom of this. So once we're down about 60%, or once it's clear what the damage is, and governments are doing enough to ameliorate that damage. Remember now that in a normal recession, once we get out of this, we'll have much more than a normal recession. We'll have a very severe recession. In a normal recession, central banks reduce interest rates by 5% to deal with the recession. But this is now the steroids coming once you revive the patient. We're already at zero across the developed world. Therefore, there's nothing to do for central banks, which means governments have to come in and start stimulating the economy. And governments will be somewhat reluctant to do this because they would have given disaster relief, which is money you spend and you never get it back. So what governments will want to do is at the end of this, they will really want to revive their economies, but they will also want to fix their balance sheets. So they will put together massive stimulus packages, and those stimulus packages will mostly be focused on infrastructure creation. So the spending will go onto roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, broadband networks, and very importantly, green energy. So it's likely that governments will spend a lot of money getting their green energy infrastructure up. So they will eventually address part of global warming as part of this as well. Just as an aside, it's interesting how governments are prepared to basically lock down their economies indefinitely in order to deal with a mortality rate of 1 or 2% from an illness. But they're not prepared to be in any way inconvenienced in order to deal with global warming, which is actually a much bigger disaster waiting to happen at the back end. And it just shows you that if the problem is immediate, governments and people will act, but if the problem is far away, governments won't act. You also see it in the way they've reacted to the coronavirus. While it was something remote to them, they failed to react, but as soon as they actually see people dying in their own vicinity, they suddenly move to lockdown. But the economic consequence of this massive stimulus at the back end is that we get a serious bull market in shares that runs between 2021 and 2027, roughly. Something very similar to the bull market we saw between 2009 and 2014. So if you think back to the credit crunch, markets worldwide came down 60%, and then they went all the way back to where they were in 5 years' time. So basically, you had about 150% return on your money. If you invested in 2009 and you stuck it out until 2014, you had about 120% return. And then there was another 30% on top of that once Donald Trump became president. So, a very serious and strong bull market following the recession. So obviously, one of the things we know about the coronavirus is that it shows you that there can be events that disrupt any normal business cycle. But this happened to come at the end of a very long upswing. So it's kind of looks a bit like a normal recession in terms of timing. But that means that I think that we can invest into equities with fairly low risk once the full consequences of the virus has been into the market. And therefore, we will actually see very good returns for our clients for a long time. Now, again, if you were in the market fully before all this started and you are going to take all the pain to the downside, that bull market will basically only take you back or a little bit beyond where you were when you started. If you are in cash while the market falls and you get in at the bottom, it will work out fantastically for you from a portfolio perspective. For business people, there will also be significant business opportunities, but also significant risk because you may take things on a little bit too early and just be slightly too far ahead of the curve if you're going to start investing into distressed companies, etc. But we think that very good returns are to be had. So what we doing at the moment is that the bulk of our clients' long-term money sits in a portfolio called the dynamic parity portfolio offshore. So first of all, it's been protected against the fall of the rand. I'll get back to the rand in a second. And secondly, that the strategy was heavy in safe assets. So those safe assets performed really well and protected our clients against the downturn. But we've actually had a long conversation with the guys at Ironclad, and we've agreed with them that for the moment, while there's this amount of uncertainty around, they will stay very, very safe. So the fund will be managed extremely conservatively, meaning they will sometimes override their rules to be more conservative than they would normally be, just to make sure that our clients come out of the other end of this hole. So effectively, where markets are now down about 20%, dynamic parity at the worst was down about 5%. So yeah, effectively, and it depends on exactly where you're measuring from, but effectively our clients have not had serious damage to their portfolios and they are ready to participate in the upswing when it comes. We will get to a point somewhere in the next 3 to 9 months where we believe it's now the opposite. At this point, we believe the returns are going to be limited and the risks are very high. We think that 6 months from now or 9 months from now, you get the opposite. The opportunities will be great and the risk will be limited. And at that point, we will agree with them to be much more aggressive, and we will let our clients know when that time comes, so that if they don't want to be aggressive and participate, they can remove money out of that strategy. But for the moment, our advice to our clients is to get into cash and to stay in cash for as long as it takes for this thing to show itself properly. Just a last little comment on the rand. The first question about the rand is that exchange rates are relative measurements. So is South Africa relative to other countries worse off because of this or not? And the answer is this problem is worldwide and it spreads through every economy in the world. And therefore, we are not necessarily worse affected than other countries. And therefore, that shouldn't lead to a dramatically lower currency. So why is the currency so weak? And there's really two answers to that. The one answer is that whenever markets fall, like when markets came down 30%, that creates a liquidity crunch. There's just not enough dollars around to actually top up all the margin calls that we see worldwide. And that creates a shortage of dollars, and that makes other currencies, non-dollar currencies, a lot weaker. So the Turkish lira and the Brazilian real and all of the emerging market exchange rate, but even the pound went to the lowest level that it's been since 1985. So the dollar becomes strong versus all other currencies, especially emerging market currencies, and that's part of why the rand is so weak. But that will reverse itself fairly quickly. So we probably go back to about a 15 rand level to the dollar fairly quickly. The other reason why the rand is weak is that our main exports are commodities. And while the world is in shutdown, they will leave very little commodities. So oil price, for instance, is right down. But that also goes for iron ore, copper, all of those things. And that negatively affects South Africa in the short run. What we would say about that is actually infrastructure creation creates massive demand for commodities. And it's very likely that governments across the world will institute massive infrastructure projects between 2021 and 2025. And we'll be back to the super cycle in commodities that we saw in the 2010s. And then actually all bets are off on how strong the rand may become in those circumstances. So whoever thought that the rand, when the rand was 12 rand to the dollar in 2001, that within a couple of years it would go all the way back to 5 rand 75 in 2006. So what we would say is quite likely that we'll see the 12 to 13 rand to the dollar levels again at that point. So careful not to become overly pessimistic about the rand. So the Chinese characteristic, while we're now talking China, the Chinese characteristic for crisis and opportunity is the same. So we're in a real crisis, but we think that that will create a real opportunity for our clients. But the way that we think we should be handling that is to stay safe. So what we're saying at the moment is go into cash. If you already have offshore assets, turn those offshore assets into dollars. If you already have South African market exposure, turn that into rands. Stay in your rands or dollars until the crisis dissipates, and then be ready to participate to the upside. The last little bit of comment I want to give is just on the South African situation. And I think that there is a significant risk in South Africa that the government overplays its hand in terms of locking down. And that it actually creates a lot of social resistance. So it's very difficult to think of a circumstance which is more conducive to the EFF increasing its support than to have a lockdown where people eventually get hungry, don't have money to buy food, have no food, come out of their shacks, have a look around, see that there's 500 other people that are also hungry and have come out of their shacks, toddle down to the closest supermarket to try to appropriate some food while we've got 500 people together, and then to get shot up at by the army because that's what you do in your duty. I cannot imagine a more conducive environment for the EFF than that. So if you're thinking back to Marikana and how much hay the EFF made from the Marikana incident, we can see multiple Marikanas if the government in South Africa doesn't play their cards right. So I think that in South Africa, it's impossible to continue the lockdown at a strict level for very long. And it's then very likely that the government will actually be forced to do one of two things. They either need to put much more disaster relief into the economy, meaning find some way of putting money into the hands of poor people who are vulnerable in these circumstances, or otherwise have a much less severe lockdown. That's my story for today. Comments, questions?
Wikus, môre is Jaco hier so. Kan jy my hoor?
Ja, ons hoor jou mooi.
Gee my net weer 'n bietjie jou oorsig van hierdie tyd wat jy sê is nie reg om nou van cash na equities toe te gaan nie. Is ons nie dalk in die groot vraag is ons in 'n V-market of 'n U-market? En as jy 'n U-market is, hoe lank is die onderste been van die U? Moet ek liewer se Engels praat of is Afrikaans reg?
Engels asseblief, Jaco, as jy omgee nie. Maybe let me just actually rephrase the question then. The question is, are we in a V market from an equity point of view, or are we in a U market? Meaning, do we recover quickly and rapidly from this, or is it something that is much longer drawn out? And the answer is that we believe that we are very much in a U or even a W formation, meaning that what you get is the markets need to come down a lot more and stay down for fairly long, because the crisis is going to be it's going to take a long time to unfold. And companies will stay under pressure for a long time. And then actually the up leg, so as soon as someone announces that the vaccine is now effective and we can come out on the other side of this within 3 to 6 months, because of that, markets are likely to kick up. But as soon as they see the economic devastation that they find on the other side of this lockdown, it's likely to come back down. And so it might even have a little bit of a W type of idea. But in our view, the bottom of the market is 6 to 9 months away, which in terms of market timing is actually quite a long time. So we think that markets go down a lot more from here, but probably in a kind of zigzag fashion that just trends lower and lower so there'll be some pickups in markets, and then it will go down, and the down leg will be stronger than the up leg for a while until we get to the bottom, and then you'll actually see that it'll take a very long time to eventually recover. But what you then get is also a zigzag pattern, but the up leg is every time is a bit stronger than the down leg. And that takes us all the way back to where we came from and even a little bit beyond, but only in about 5 or 6 years' time. So I don't think we'll see the highs that we saw at the beginning of this year again before 2025.
The past week, there's been a reasonably significant up leg on the equity markets. Do you see that just as a blip on the horizon? We must prepare for the big down leg.
Yeah. So the up leg actually briefly from in New York, the up leg was briefly from bottom to top 20%. So you went down 30 and then up 20. Then that means you're still down about 17. And then before the day was out, it fell another 4%. So we kind of down 20% roughly still in New York. So yes, there's been a significant recovery from roughly 30% down to roughly 20% down. So that's quite a significant move in the market. And I think that you'll see repeats of that. But the next time we see a down leg, it's likely to take us down to more than 30%. So what we'll see is up legs and down legs, but the down legs will be stronger than the up legs. And every time it happens, they will start pricing in more of the bad news. Johan Redlinghuis, het jy vir ons kommentaar?
I'm just wondering, Wikus, what the situation is in terms of unemployment. I mean, your example, the scary example, is when people come out of their shacks and they're hungry and they go to the nearest supermarket or whatever. The potential for rioting and chaos in the market is a really scary scenario there. But what is your view on unemployment, do you think, in the next year?
I think it's inevitable that unemployment will become significantly more severe in South Africa as well. So South African companies are not as flexible as American companies. So in America, people fire very easily, and because they fire easily, they'll hire very easily as well. So within 2 weeks, they let 10 million people go. In South Africa, I think there's already a large part of people who are self-employed. So large companies have already told consultants to go home and not come back type of idea for the moment. So while the crisis is lasting, there's quite a lot of people that have already seen their income impaired. But what will happen next is that companies where your income cease to happen, if you are a travel agent.
Yeah.
You employ 6 people and you get 0 income for 3 months. You don't have money to pay those 6 people anymore, and you'll let them go.
Yeah.
And eventually, in fact, because you have to pay your rent, etc., you might very well close your travel agency. So a lot of companies will go bankrupt, and with it, there will be a significant increase in unemployment. So in South Africa, there's about 8 million people formally employed. I would be extremely surprised if we don't lose at least 1 million of those jobs in this incident. And in South Africa, the unemployment insurance and the safety net for unemployed people is not very good. So the one thing we do have in South Africa is we've got grants. We have a very large number of people, and those grants are spread very widely. So my own view of the world is that what the government should be doing, just to put money into the hands of vulnerable people, is they should double the grants. So as long as we're in lockdown, the grants will be double.
Yeah.
Because what's happening to the person who loses his job in Soweto is he actually goes back to Limpopo and he goes, sits on Granny's farm, and Granny buys mealie meal with a grant. And the unemployed person from Soweto eats with Granny. And maybe they'll slaughter the goat as well. But if you one easy way to help vulnerable people in South Africa is just to pay out significantly more grants. That would be a big help. But it's not fully there, because the people not receiving grants are really now also going to become vulnerable, because apart from unemployment, there's a lot of people that have been sent home by their employers on half pay. We'll try to pay you 50% of your salary while we're asking you not to work. So that kind of thing is very widespread in South Africa. For a lot of other people, they've been told, you know what, we're losing some of our turnover. We want to stay open. We're going to pay 80% of salaries.
Yeah.
So please try to work from home and we'll pay you 80% of your salary. So we're seeing a lot of that around South Africa. But South Africa has a lot of vulnerable people, unfortunately. We already start with a very high level of unemployment and a lot of informal employment. So a lot of people who were informally employed. So I'm thinking about Prayer in the basement who washes our cars.
Yeah.
Prayer will now have no income while no one's going to work. And there's millions of those people around South Africa. So South Africa has a very, very significant social problem that will be strongly exacerbated by this.
Oh. Wikus?
So in my mind, I think the government, you've got to give them credit. They were fast to react quite strongly to the coronavirus, and that up to now seems to have saved quite a few lives. So if they hadn't gone into the lockdown, it would most likely be significantly more severe already in South Africa. The problem that you have is you've got a very competent president and a very competent minister of health, and then nothing. The implementation capacity to the lower end is virtually non-existent. And if you send the troops and the police into the townships, you very quickly have more people killed by the troops and the police than by the coronavirus.
Yeah.
So the ability to implement properly and with cooperation from your population is very limited. So my own view in South Africa is the virus will eventually spread into the vulnerable populations. A lot of people will get sick and die. But to some extent, what that does is it allows us to open fairly quickly and to then re-employ as many of those people as possible, as quickly as possible.
Wikus, a very important point you make is that a complete lockdown is not sustainable in South Africa, and it has to be moderated if the country is going to survive at all. Would you just comment on that? Maybe give a timeline again. I think you mentioned September would be a time where we should be through it. Would you comment on that again?
Yeah, it's most likely what typically happens in an uncontrolled epidemic. So my own view is that even if we try to sustain the strict lockdown, I don't think we've got the ability to do that. So I think that so I think there are social issues where we may not want to do it, but even if we try, I don't think we can. So I think it's already started in the townships. So we're getting the stats out of places like Khayelitsha, Limpopo, and so on, the first cases, and in KwaMashu and near Durban and so on. So I think that the virus spreads. Typically, the epidemic then peaks after about 3 months. So the worst story, and part of this is that winter is actually detrimental to this, because you actually put it on top of normal flu. It also looks like the virus, like flu, flourishes in cold conditions more than warm. So we'll be hitting this midwinter. Midwinter will be the worst time, likely in South Africa. A lot of people will be sick and a lot of people will be dying. But then after about a month of that, the dying slows down because you're now getting the general immunity kicking in. And roughly by September, most people in the country will have had it. So basically that means everybody except me, because I'm locking myself down very strictly. So by September, everybody in South Africa except me will have had the virus, and we'll be able to emerge on the other side with general immunity to the virus in the population.
Thank you.
Most likely.
Wikus, hi, this is Ludovic.
Hello.
Hi, Ludovic.
Hello,
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, just a quick question. I may have missed your comment. Just from I mean, you spoke about your existing customers and your clients and being conservative. What's your view on the bond market? I mean, I've seen some figures where they actually about 2 weeks ago, apparently it was ideal to buy short-term bonds. About 2 weeks ago, you would have gotten about a 13% return on that on short-term money. So do you have any view on the bond market right now?
So the South African bond market, in many ways, we're not really big players in the South African bond market or in the emerging world bond markets, because bonds inherently have less return than equities, but they also actually, if you're in an emerging market, bond market, it displays many of the same risks as equity. So you're getting the same downside, or the same downside, except that you don't have the same upside. So we're not big players in the bond market, but the bond market is very much linked to the to the currency market. So typically what would happen is that if your currency is taking strain, your bond rates would likely also go up, and that does represent an opportunity, because as the currency returns to reasonableness, your rates will also return to reasonableness. So actually the opportunity is more in the long bonds than in the short bonds, because in the short bonds, you get a good rate for a couple of months, but that's it. Whereas in the long bonds, if you buy when the rates are high and you hold on, you can have significant profits. So it is one of the places where there may be an opportunity to make some money. The problem with that is that you're also going into a situation where government finances will come under severe strain, because also tax income will collapse in the short run. So government income will be under severe strain. Plus, there will be lots of strain on the expense side. There will be lots of demands for, first of all, disaster relief, and then later on for stimulus. So the amount of government bonds that need to be issued to finance that will be very high. So yes, I think there will be some opportunities, but we don't think it's anywhere close to a sure thing. So we basically mostly focusing on the equity side of things, and let's say the global, in a global matter, we think that the real safe asset around the world is US government bonds. So because when people run to safety, US government bonds will do well. There may well be some juice left in the US government bond side in the dollar portfolios. But mostly we think the biggest opportunity by far strategically is to be in cash and then to be able to convert that cash into equities at the low point and then hold on to those equities for multiple years. We think that's the biggest opportunity that's being presented by this whole event.
And the timing for that you mentioned is early next year, do you think?
Let's say somewhere from September onwards, most likely. So from our point of view, we're looking at from 2 points of view. If markets are down 60% from the top, we would say you can just buy and hold and you will eventually get a very good return on your money, even if it goes down more in the short run. So if it's down far enough, we'll want to participate. The other thing we'll watch is even if it doesn't come down 60%, we'll want to be sure that the markets are pricing in the amount of trouble that the economy is in. And as soon as markets are pricing that in and policymakers are also recognizing it and taking steps to ameliorate that, then we'll want to participate. Just to give you an idea, we would say that if there's an additional $5 trillion of stimulus being put into the American economy, that would be about right. So we wouldn't want to start participating until they've announced another $5 trillion of stimulus to get past this. And just to give you a relative measure, the stimulus package, the Obama stimulus package after the credit crunch was $1 billion. So we're now already sitting at $2 billion, and we think that it should actually go to $7 billion. So it gives you, it refers to that, the extent of the problems being caused by these lockdowns. It's absolutely massive.
Okay, thank you, Wikus.
Good. Thanks, guys. I think let's adjourn on that. So we will be doing what we're going to do from next week is we're going to have a kind of updated repeat of this session, and then we'll also just do another meeting where we just update, say what's new. So for people who don't want to listen to the whole story again, they'll be able to just dial in for the what's new this week portion. So we'll try to keep our clients updated as things progress, because as the one guy says, we're living in COVID time. Everything happens at a much higher speed than you would normally think that it does. So in a week's time, our perspective on this may be significantly different. Okay, guys, thank you very much for dialing in.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully see most of you next week.
Thanks, Wikus.
Thank you.
Okay, tot ziens, Jaco.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. John, thanks for dialing in.